Hi, we continue in Genesis 23 as Abraham's negotiations with the Hittites and with Ephron in particular continue. We're picking up here at verse 12, and if you haven't followed, I'd encourage you to look at the previous videos so you can see where we are and how we're reading this, using especially the work of Sternberg, whose close reading has really taught us, meaning me, but also many other biblical scholars, that's the us, of how to read carefully and really extract all the possibilities out of a story that we might miss on the surface. And so we've been following the three levels here of politeness, politics, and prophets, and it's gotten us to this point where Abraham made an offer to buy the cave, and Ephron responded with the cave and the field. And so that's where we are now in verse 12. And all this is happening without ever saying the word sell and ever saying any of the direct issues. That's all just below the surface. So we'll pick it up right here. And as we do, we can see here the last pieces of the negotiation, including the semi-legal agreement that is embedded in the book of Genesis, although we don't know there's a copy kept for Ephron, and there's no notary as far as we know or any other formal legal procedure. But the text of Genesis 23 becomes itself the legal document, at least for the Israelites in the future, as we saw last time with how this passage in the description of Machpelah throughout the following generations is always understood and stated explicitly as having come from Ephron the Hittite. So we look at the key words here, and we see, and the key words include my translating more literally, so we can see some of the ways the key words are hidden by the translation. As we pick up here, we see that it's shifted from the Hittites 3 times in the previous verse to the people of the land here, and Ephron in particular. Notice Hittites are not mentioned here, but they will be mentioned 3 times again in the conclusion. And the continued emphasis on listen, listen, listen. Some of that's covered over by text, but it sounds to readers who aren't familiar that they've agreed, but there's only if you'll listen to me, but please listen to me, wondering why people are talking that way if they've already agreed, which is why we had to look carefully using Sternberg, as I said, and some other commentators to hear what Abraham and Ephron hear, but that we as untrained readers in ancient Middle Eastern negotiation tactics might not hear. So let's pick it up from there with in verse 12 here, framing with verse 7, as we saw Abraham stood up and bowed here, and he bowed here. But now, no longer to the face of the Hittites, but to the face of the people of the land. And that's what's described here. The face of here is translated as before, and as Sternberg notes below, the wording defies resolution to suggestive effect. Abraham's bow covers the 2 addressees, Ephron and the Hittites, at once, because both are in the picture and the individual cannot really be told apart from the collective. For Ephron remains sitting amidst the Hittites, the show includes a make-believe of a 3 rather than 2-party dialogue. And really it's between the Hittites, and Ephron can't do anything or won't do anything without the consent of his fellow people. So he understands that, and he says to Ephron, in the hearing, or literally in the ears of, as we heard in verse 10, as we'll hear again in verse 16. Notice it's in the ears of here, but later in the legal resolution it will be in the eyes of the Hittites, so the ears and the eyes of the people of the land. If you will only listen to me. Expressing that again in really strong language this time, expressing that he's not hearing that they're hearing him. He really just wants the cave, and he's willing to pay for it. But this is what he offers instead. I will give, highlighting the give again, and as Sternberg again helps us with, to suggest that if the one act of voluntary giving is an accomplished fact, so is the other. Thus, and from my note, Abraham's giving is not a preliminary to a price, but an offer at the market price, which Ephron rejects in favor of an extortionate price, as we'll see momentarily. So I will give the price, which is the suggestion of the market price, of the field here. Notice, not the cave, and not the cave in the field. The field implies the cave, but what he wanted was a cave. He didn't want a field, but he's going along with Ephron's language here to try to get the deal sealed. And then he adds, accept it from me, or literally take it from me. As Sternberg notes, Abraham, having been coerced into making a bid for a site beyond his requirements, he must now press the urbane blackmailer to accept his ransom as a personal favor. And notice that's what's being suggested here at the end, that Abraham's letting Ephron save face from being an extortioner, here taking advantage of Abraham's desperation with a dead wife to suggest that he's doing Abraham a favor, and Ephron will respond in exchange that Abraham is merely paying a small trifle for something so important, and that they're equals here, although we'll see it's not quite like that. so that he may bury my dead there. And now it's the first time we hear a specific place. It started with the vague negativity of what man will withhold from you any of the choicest places, but now we have a very specific place. And so he's trying to seal the deal here, and this is what we hear from Ephron. And yet again, the New RSV omits translating Lamor lo, which completes a sequence of lo statements, which were no. So here we can hear it again as we heard it above. Ephron answered Abraham, "No, my lord, listen to me." And that's what I have in my note down below. "No, sir, you listen." And again, repeating my lord, emphasizing not that Ephron is deferring to Abraham, but that he's recognizing that Abraham's playing humble is not really the situation here. So continuing to raise Abraham up as a esteemed prince, as he called him earlier. A piece of land, and notice now it's a piece of land, no longer the field, no longer the cave. It's simply an eretz, a piece of land. And as Sternberg notes, brings the judicial context to the fore, wielding the citizen rights vested in the people of the land as stick and carrot at once. Which is to say, as carrot, the incentive is that they're willing to agree, and as stick, you're going to have to take our terms here. Worth 400 shekels of silver, which is an outrageous amount, although as we noted last time, in the parallel with the threshing floor that David buys upon which the temple will be built, at least according to 1 Chronicles, we notice the difference here, and that might highlight something of which text was first. In the story in 2 Samuel, we hear that David only paid 50 shekels for the same piece of land, although it's attributed a different name. But in 1 Chronicles, perhaps coming after Genesis, says 600 gold shekels in the face of the 400 silver shekels here, which is perhaps to highlight from the 1 Chronicles perspective that putting a down payment on the land for the temple was more important than just the down payment on the land as land. And for Chronicles, that's clear that the building of the Jerusalem temple is the point of the entire journey from creation all the way to the monarchy. So that's their focus, and certainly it seems like it's a rewriting to suggest it costs more to buy the threshing floor for the temple than it did to put a down payment on the land itself. So Ephron asked this as a rhetorical question, but we already know the answer. What is a piece of land worth? What's 400 shekels of silver between you and me? Which is to say, between the superior and rich dependent. But it doesn't sound that way on the surface. It sounds like between a mighty prince and the local landowner. So now they've reached an agreement, bury your dead, and we get to the legal provision, which I'll continue here, and we'll finish it on this video here. As Sternberg notes, the only sound heard now is the jingle of silver being weighed out. And there's a little play on words here on the weighed out. It's the same root as shekel. So as Sternberg notes, he shekels them out, so to speak. The word shekel meaning to weigh out as a measure of money. So the word for agreed here is listened to, and I highlighted that here as the finally listened. So after all the pleading, listen to me, no, listen to me, Abraham listened to Ephron, weighed it out, the silver he had named in the hearing of the Hittites. But as my note below says, we don't hear this exchange, leaving open the possibility that more was said that is not reported, because we did not hear a price named other than in the mouth of Ephron. But Abram had not agreed to that until it's measured out here. Then it adds, according to the weights current among the merchants, which makes it sound like it's market price, but that's perhaps misleading to suggest the merchants in Hittite country favor Ephron. And there's no basis for which to compare that in terms of a wider economy to know. So now we hear the legal conclusion of this in these final verses. So, and verse 17 and 20 each start, interestingly, with the Hebrew vayakam, which means and stood up. And I don't see any translation that grapples with that. We've seen stood up earlier. Abraham stood up here, and he stood up here. And it seems to continue here even though there's nobody standing up. So it's a curious artifact there in the Hebrew text. So they've stood up, somebody, the field of Ephron in Machpelah, and notice the precise description here, more precise than we've heard previously. In Machpelah, notice it's described as in Machpelah here. The field of Ephron in Machpelah. Machpelah wasn't the place before. Machpelah is simply the name of the cave, which is in the field. So now it's saying the field is in a place called Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, or to the face of Mamre, here and in verse 19, as it'll be named here, facing Mamre, where it's translated correctly there. The field with the cave in it, and all the trees that were in it. That's a new piece here. That's from the Septuagint adding that. Throughout its whole area, or literally up to its boundary. And we don't know how big that is, but that's more description than either of the negotiators had named out loud in the hearing of the Hittites or in the hearing of us as readers. So it's no longer just the cave and the field, but the trees, which have value, of course, and it's an agricultural field. So in theory, Abraham could grow things here other than the fact that the agreement is simply as a burial place. So the fact that he gets the trees are largely irrelevant. He's not allowed to either harvest them if they're fruit trees or cut them down just for wood. So it's just an extraneous element that's been forced into the deal. But he does get it as a possession. In the eyes of the Hittites here, in the presence isn't repeated a second time, of all who went in the gate of his city, which raises an interesting possibility. Abraham has this possession here, but he's not allowed to use it for anything other than burial. So what does that mean? Does he have to come into the Hittites' town, which is unnamed here, every time he wants to bury a family member? Of course, other than Sarah, other people will be doing the burying, including his sons burying him, as we'll see in chapter 25. And we see no future engagement with the Hittites in terms of the burial, although it's always described as the field bought from Ephron. And so we see the conclusion here. After this, Abraham buried Sarah, his woman, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre. That is Hebron here, but notice leaving out the Kiriath Arba we heard at the beginning here, matching that, in the land of Canaan. The field, and again it starts with then stood up, and the cave, notice leaving out the trees and the whole area on the finale here, passed from the Hittites into Abraham's possession as a burying place. And that's where it'll be throughout the generations. So as we continue now, Abraham has one more thing to do, at least in his mind, and that's to keep this going another generation. And although he and Isaac are living apart, and we have no reason to think they've seen each other in perhaps 2 decades, the old Abraham is now going to engage in one more task to try to find a fitting partner for his son Isaac. See you for the beginning of that long story next time. Bye-bye.